So welcome everybody. My name's Ned McConnell and I'm the curator at DRAF, which is a private foundation based on the David Roberts collection. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. We're here today because we're going to be talking to Nina Beier, who is a Danish artist based in Berlin, who works in sculpture, drawing, performance, lots of different media. Primarily, we're talking to her because we were doing a collaboration together as part of Glasgow International, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But this particular initiative is in partnership with Performance Exchange, which is a kind of performance-based art fair that's doing research and looking into ways for people, how the market and performance is kind of connected. This came out of a kind of desire from both Performance Exchange and us to support live and event-based practices, because obviously in this current moment, lots of those kind of things have been cancelled or postponed. These sessions are every Thursday at 5 p.m. We're kind of trialing that at the moment, and so it would be good to know from you guys if this is a kind of convenient slot to do this kind of a talk for you to listen to, and you can feed that back via the Q&A button that should be at the bottom of your screen. And yeah, we're going to do these regularly Thursdays at 5 p.m. And so a bit about the format of this talk is Nina and I are going to talk for about half an hour over the top of a kind of slideshow of Nina's works, so that you guys can get a bit of an idea about what she does and what the works that we're talking about look like. And then we'll have a kind of some questions at the end. So throughout the talk, you can actually type in your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so that we can then have a look at them at the end and pick some. So the reason that Nina and I are doing this talk, as I said, is because we were collaborating as part of Glasgow International, which was unfortunately postponed due to the current coronavirus situation. Glasgow International is a kind of biannual international arts festival that happens in Glasgow, obviously, and we were going to do a kind of presentation of performances at SWG3, which was as part of their launch program. And given that it was postponed, we've decided that we would do this kind of talk to open up Nina's practice a bit and talk about what we were going to do, but also what is in her practice and what are the kind of main themes of it. So just to get started, I'm going to start this video for you guys. And we're going to turn off our videos so you can just focus on the video that's playing. So the work that you can see there is called Tragedy, which is a performance where a dog is kind of told to play dead on this Persian rug. And so the dog lies there playing dead, which is a kind of absurd theatrical gesture, and is also there's something in that about this kind of tension between something which is represented and which is also its reality. So Nina, I wonder, first of all, maybe you could talk a bit about what the role of representation plays in your work.
Hello everyone. Yes, I mean this piece is maybe like quite a dramatic take on this idea of representation as it plays out in my work. It's basically relying on the projection of the viewer onto this animal that is clearly not aware of which image it is producing for us. The way that, like, the protocol of the work is basically that the dog trainer tells the dog to play dead on the carpet and steps off and keeps basically lock eyes with the animal for the duration of the performance. And the dog somehow in this moment becomes this still life, or this sculpture lying completely still, but held in place by this gaze between the human and the animal. And the moment that the dog trainer then signals to the dog that it can rise, it will spring back to life. So there is this strange kind of sense of the spell of the gaze. And I think in many ways, this is like the strongest illustration of my interest in this idea of projection. There's this, you know, the expression deer caught in a headlight, somehow that the spotlight on the animal freezes the moment and creates this image. At the same time as the dog is its own body, it is itself, it is a living being. It's also an image of itself somehow.
And is also, I guess, in some ways quite unaware of the representation that it's making. You know, there's a kind of there's something that we as humans are kind of projecting onto this dog, and the dog is both the representation and the thing itself.
Yes, this is a theme that somehow seems to sneak its way into a lot of my work. And for example, the coco de mer seats that you saw before in the chairs, or did they already? Were they there? I actually didn't look at the screen. Yes, they were. Are these coconuts that have been like threatened to become extinct because people have collected them forever because of their resemblance to a female nude. But somehow this image of fertility cancels out the seed's actual ability to come to fruition. So these objects that are somehow caught in the middle between being themselves and an image of themselves is something that I continuously return to. And all of them, I mean, in this case, again, it's relying on our projection, our image, that like the absurd idea that a palm tree would produce a female nude exists in our gaze alone.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the works that's going through this particular slideshow is, well, there's two that involve humans kind of performing, and I think there's something interested in one of them, which is called Exercise, where there's two women practicing yoga. One is the instructor and the other one is the student, and I think it brings up something that we were talking about before around this idea of representations which are private and representations that are specifically for an audience. And I think, you know, something like Exercise or yoga, it has both of those things within it, because you could do it privately for yourself, and that's an action, but you can also argue that there is some kind of desire to represent something within that action.
I think this the strangeness of Exercise, like lying so close to like a choreographed dance routine, or the fact that when we look at this exercise, it does conjure images of like the wholesome and the sexual, this kind of choreography almost of also, I guess, the fact that when several people are doing the same thing at the same time, it recalls images of synchronized choreographies that are made and designed for us to have feelings and conjure up images in our minds. And with the Exercise somehow being almost a forbidden thing to watch because it is meant as a private experience, I like how this moment when you transfer it into an exhibition space, and in this case where it looks like a domestic space, but it's actually in a show home. I did a couple of exhibitions in different show homes around.
Right.
which are these spaces again that sit in between being a home and being an image of a home. So somehow, like, the way that this bounces back and forth and creates this like a pendulum effect, that we're seeing these flickering images that constantly change in our minds. Yeah.
And I think, you know, obviously, you know, the thing that comes to mind when we talk a lot about this idea of representation of the thing and the thing itself is photography. And because obviously people often look at photographs and will say when they're looking at that photograph, this is my dad, this is my mum, this is my brother or sister or son or daughter, or they'll say this is the thing, but it's obviously not. It's a carefully constructed representation of the thing, which is also kind of held in this death-like moment. You know, photography has always been related to death in some way, from death masks and things. But I think there was something that Roland Barthes once said, I think in his book, Camera Obscura, where he talks about wanting to find an image of his dead mother, and he was looking through all of these images of his mum from, you know, lots of different ages, and was unable to see her in any of them. It didn't feel like it was her until he found this one of her as a child, and he could see his mum as a child in this image of her as a child, which seems kind of strange because obviously he wouldn't have known her as a child. But what he then goes on to talk about is that she was ill when towards the end of her life, and he was her carer. So actually the representation of her as a child was more real to him than this kind of than an image of her. Which kind of brings me on to talking about drama, which is the work with the actors, because I think this idea of representation and reality is particularly complicated when it comes to something like acting, where someone is playing a role, but they are also that character in some ways.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the piece came about, it's basically an actor asked to cry into her drink. And the piece came about from speaking to actors about this moment, because almost all acting techniques deal with like different ways of accessing real emotions and channeling them into a performed emotion. And of course, in that field of tension, you can only perform and actually cry at the same time. There's no distinction between the real and the represented.
Yeah.
The moment you realize it, but of course there's a journey in trying to get there, which becomes very visible in this case, of struggling to bring out these tears. And the strange next layer, of course, is that with that, in the eyes of the viewer of this performance, there are all these emotions that are brought up, that it's a very difficult thing to watch someone cry and do nothing. So somehow the distance between the viewer and the performer and the projection again between these 2 points become very intense in this moment.
Yeah. I want to move on to this next little slideshow, because there's a work in that, and I'll just do one thing at a time here. So there's one work in particular that was shown at DRAF actually a number of years ago, called Scheme, in which there was an online organic vegetable box scheme that was delivered to the gallery at kind of timed intervals throughout. Was it through the whole show, Nina?
Yes.
So and then each week the old vegetables would be taken away, but the crates would stay there.
Yes, so the crates, the boxes of crates would grow from each delivery, so the crates would stay behind. But each time a new box of vegetables would arrive, it would the old vegetables or the old looking vegetables would be exchanged by fresh ones. Somehow like keeping this image of abundance and horn of plenty active.
And can you talk a bit, and this, I think this idea of like nature and representation and a sort of flattening of nature into the realm of the human experience. I feel like there's definitely something of that in this, but also in the previous work that we saw, Coco de Mer.
Yeah, they both somehow like transfer into their own image, no? But like the way that the aging of the vegetable somehow replicates the aging of all living beings, and the way that the kind of borrowed protocol of this like weekly delivery of fresh vegetables is playing together and creating this moment where we are aware of this constant renewing of things to just keep this perpetual image perfect. It has that vibe, the king is dead, long live the king, the logic of the fact that we replace one thing with another to constantly stay afloat or stay alive. And it deals with this thing. I've returned to it many times, but like Bassin's mummy complex, I named a work after it once as well. But the idea that representational art is somehow like directly connected with this idea of mummification, that we try to freeze the world or create this kind of frozen representation, surface-based representation of the world in order to ward off our own death.
Yeah. And maybe you could talk a bit about, I guess, thinking about that liveness in your work, because, you know, some of these, particularly things like Scheme or Beast, in which there's these bull simulators that have powdered milk on them. They're performance, but they're obviously, they're not using bodies, but they're impermanent, as you were just saying. So maybe you could talk a bit about what attracts you to liveness because a lot of your work has this kind of transitory or perpetually moving element of it. Like it's almost never static. Whether it's organic or not, a lot of your work has this kind of perpetual motion. So I was wondering, you know, maybe you can just talk a bit about what liveness means to your work and why it's so important.
Yeah, I guess, for example, with Beast, there's this sad story being told, like the body of the animal rejecting human domination. And in the movement, the choreography of the movement of this object is made specifically for the purpose of rejecting the human body, and somehow the body is at the center of this object without being present, and I think this is again tying back to the previous works, but for example, if you look at Pack, the piece with the young man smoking a pack of cigarettes, that's also in the slideshow, which, by the way, also one of the pictures is also from a DRAF performance that Vincent orchestrated. But this piece is basically following the protocol of a pack of cigarettes, and it's always a young man standing alone outside of the exhibition space, chain smoking a pack of cigarettes, so lighting one cigarette with the other. And the performance is over once he's smoked all 20 of them. and somehow within this action, there's the crazy task somehow is death-defying. The fact that we use this image of the lone smoker as a filmic kind of trope has a lot to do with this idea of the difference between reality and the image of the body, because the actual smoker and the reality of smoking, the presence of death within that act and the defiance of death within that act is somehow completely walking hand in hand. So I don't know, I'm not entirely sure how I made that connection from your question, but
no, it's good. And then I guess, I mean, I feel like maybe on the other end of the spectrum from death is the complete works, which I think is, you know, is a really incredibly beautiful and very simple idea. That so you invited retired dancers to attempt to go through all of the choreographies they've ever performed without rehearsing and from memory. And so this was performed at Tate in the Tanks. Was it in 2012?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think though the idea that the body holds within it all of this memory, muscle memory, actions, but also knowledge, you know, feels almost resistant to that idea of that we were just talking about in terms of solidifying existence or memory in perpetuity.
Yes, it's somehow like the way that the body becomes a container of all this culture and all these stories, and how the life of the individual performer becomes this narrative through all these stories, all this material is something that I was interested in trying to unfold with this piece. But at the same time, that there is this human looking for the right word, but the consequence for the individual human of being this high performance body. So for example, this image is a newly retired ballet dancer who was 40 at the time of the performance, and she had just finished her professional life. So the idea of being retired within dance, depending on what type of dance you have been performing, can happen at a relatively young age. So the idea that their bodies are also used up and carrying, they are these beasts of burden somehow related to the bodies in the other pieces.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess they give up a huge amount of their physical body to their practice.
Yes, and that space that once retired and the body stops being able to perform as in the same way as it has done previously, what is left then are these like part movements or indications and fragments that then in between the space of what memory allows and muscle memory allows and the body allows, then puts together kind of a new collage that tells the story of the coherent whole somehow.
Yeah. Shall we move on to the next slideshow? Okay, is that showing?
Yes.
Good. So in this work, which is again linked to something that we were talking about presenting for GI, this is a series of remote controlled cars that are transporting human hair around the gallery at quite a high speed. And so there's this kind of strange mixture of these luxury cars with very sleek design, and then being kind of controlled a bit erratically and zipping around the gallery. And then they're filled with, it's real human hair that's in the cars, which is obviously kind of starting to think about value and status, and what is the value, say, of that there is someone in the world who's growing their hair and then cutting it off and then selling it in these kind of high-end luxury cars.
Yeah, the wigs are a motif that I've returned to several times throughout my practice, and this interest in that both as a material and a crop that grows on the planet, and how they carry all this history with them of both having this aspect of being this trade object that really highlights where on the planet human labor and human time is more or less valued, at the same time as they are also these blank canvases, because they're dyed and permed and changed to then replicate the hair types of wherever they're shipped to. But then again, one of these objects that somehow sit in between being an image of hair and real hair at the same time has made it like one of these things that I haven't been able to let go of.
Yeah.
And I think the image of the luxury car and the transportation of this material around kind of spoke to each other for me, and it relates to for example the piece we just saw here with the hand rolled cigars in the sinks.
Yeah.
Again, the material that the cigar has this complicated story of trade history, and as a symbol it has this changing quality as well, that we have related it to power and patriarchy, and now in many ways it's kind of an embarrassing object, an object that has changed its status radically. So I think I'm interested in these, again, like this fluctuating space where objects are not permanent and the way that we perceive them keeps on flickering. So back to that space of lack of permanence somehow being there even in a physical object.
Yeah. And I think, in particular in the work you're just describing, Plug, with the cigars and the sinks, there's something, within a lot of your work as well about exchange and process of exchange, whether it's monetary or cultural or whatever, that you're very interested in the kind of journeys that objects or representations take, and how they kind of accrue these different layers of value and status.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Guardians, the piece that was in the previous little slideshow with the marble lions that host beard trimmings and soap in their negative shapes. There's something about those being, because those are the heaviest, most impossible objects I've ever gotten my hands on. These are actual marble lions that have been carved out of huge pieces of heavy stone. But at the same time, I've like the journey that the motif of the guardian lion has taken over time is so much in flux somehow. The fact that the lion sculpture is one of the earliest motifs that we know, and it has appeared all over the planet in different forms, and how, at least in like recent history, it's in Western culture, it's been somehow marking public institutions, entrances to public institutions, somehow defending our culture and our knowledge and our law and all these things. And then slowly it's moving towards like demarcating this boundary between private property and the people. So the fact that even like the symbolic journey of an object like that is in constant flux is what drew me to, for example, an object like that.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's just one more work that I really want to talk about, which is manual therapy, in which there's a kind of a robotic massage chair, and then on the chair is placed precious and noble metals from a variety of sources, like could be electronic waste or the dental industry, and then there's also kind of variety of currencies put into that. And as the chair massages, it sort of moves the material around as though it's kind of really enjoying fondling it or something.
Yeah, there is a little video of this piece. Your description is definitely what I imagined before the work came together. There's this strange thing that happened in reality, that it became a very sexualized image somehow as well. There's definitely a vaginal shape in the chair that I hadn't anticipated. But there is this almost chewing on this mutability of the metals and chewing on the value of this raw material somehow. That was a little.
So this is the work you can see now, yeah. And I think there's a video that comes up in a second, isn't there? Yeah, there we go.
But I've worked with the idea of the metal as this material that's in constant flux and can turn liquid and hard again, like the basics of permanent sculpture. I've also, for example, cut up a number of bronze sculptures that depicted knights and a revolutionary Mexican fighter, and kept only the things that depicted metal, so the rest of the sculpture would go back into the same economy that it came from. These sculptures were originally purchased at the price of the metal,
right?
So somehow circulating this logic again is something that is recurring in this piece.
I wonder about these, because obviously with things like sculpture, it tends to be that one would make a sculpture and then it would be finished. But I guess with some of these works, they have the potential to be kind of changed a bit or tweaked when you show them in slightly different contexts. Is that something that you do regularly?
Yeah, I think I clearly have an issue with the idea that anything could be permanent. But I think I mean, for example, the piece that you see here, it's like the ritual of the tide somehow like swallowing the piece and the sculptures reappearing and disappearing on a daily basis is somehow what to me justifies the making something that is by virtue of a permanent sculpture. This is a permanent installation.
Yeah.
So I think I can only find like a comfort with the work if there is something that is still alive in there.
Yeah. And where is this installed?
That's on the coast of Belgium.
Okay. Okay, great. I think now is maybe a good time to see if there's any questions.
Okay, it says, I'm curious to hear Nina talk more about these sculptures with the Mars bars and the asphalt slabs. So this piece is basically, yeah, made out of these cut asphalt pieces that are left when whenever there's a change of asphalt in a street, what they cut out these pieces by using a huge saw and cutting these very straight lines through the asphalt, and then it's ripped up in these pieces that almost resemble like broken chunks of chocolate or something. So it's just the bringing together of these two elements. And what I was curious about, I think, is partly one of the things, at least, is this thing that happens when you replicate this illustration technique of like the cross-sectional illustration, which we know from both from like science when we try to understand nature, and then from design when we try to construct some man-made new objects. So somehow like this illustration technique that is right in between our two ways of interacting with this planet, being replicated in the sculpture. And as you look at the sculpture, this thing happens that you almost see a flat representation at the same time as you see this very physical material, this stuff that's there, that's heavy and smelly, and you can smell the asphalt, you can smell the chocolate. The chocolate is slowly like crystallizing, while this dialogue of these different materials, it's a very present kind of material object. But of course, I've this absurd kind of image of everything from the ground on this planet to the stars, somehow like conflating and attempting to illustrate everything.
Great. So we have one from Rose Lejeune. And she is wondering, how does this sense of ongoing liveness manifest itself when works enter collections?
Oh, sorry, I was scrolling down to find it. Here we are. How does the sense of ongoing life? Well, I mean, this is always a thing to be negotiated, and depending on the different works, it's a different kind of discussion. It's not there's not a lot of live works that end up in collections, by the way.
So just for some context, Rose is from Performance Exchange, so she's working on at the moment how live and performance works might end up in collection.
Yeah. No, and often there are these very strict kind of protocols that I borrow from life, basically. So, for example, the vegetable box is very simply the logic of signing the exhibition space up to a vegetable box scheme, and then the instruction to kind of replenish at all times is carried out by whoever is manning the piece. So a lot of the works have this kind of straightforward instruction that just needs to be carried out.
So they're in some ways they're kind of instructional works where you would set out what needs to be done to reenact them at some point in the future.
Yes, and also I guess, for example, if thinking about the smoking of the pack of cigarettes, there is that protocol that's very straightforward, and then the way that it comes to life each time a new young smoker then carries it out is to me a really interesting way that it unfolds, and also partly why I chose to make these little slideshows with several versions of the same piece, because there is the activation is keeping the piece alive, just like the vegetable box, I suppose.
Lucy is saying, as the meanings of the images seem so important, how is that mediated to an audience, and how important is it that a viewer understands the backstory or journey of the material? I
think those images exist in any viewer's mind, but they will be different, of course, for each viewer of the piece. And I'm curious about exactly that, the ability of these actions or objects to create these images. but as projections, they're relying on both the screen and the gaze, or the person who projects. So of course it's not locked down. I'm merely just sharing my views on it.
I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously a lot of the material that you use as a kind of starting point, or as the kind of base materials of your work, are quite kind of culturally loaded already. And obviously there's nuances around what people bring to that, but I get the feeling that that's also part of the kind of mechanisms that you want to kind of enact, is that people are bringing their own kind of cultural assumptions about these representations, and that layering up of these cultural representations or images, I guess, is kind of part of that process of building up these things.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm deeply interested in material culture as such, and the fact that everything is just like heavily loaded with their own intention and production and the journey they've gone through and how they've been traded and understood, and basically the way that things obtain symbolic value to us and how that changes all the time. So even an object that I employ at some point, when I create a sculpture or a performance, will change during its own life. So I've seen my own work also transform up in front of my own eyes, and my own understanding of these objects change. Yeah. So I definitely welcome that.
So Phoebe is asking if you could talk a bit about about Pack, with the young man smoking, and why you chose a man rather than, say, a woman or someone of mixed genders as your subject.
I'm relying on these cultural tropes a lot in my work. So, for example, and I guess that's also answering the previous question about like which images are like conjured in people's minds. I'm definitely trying to unpack existing visual tropes in my work, and the image of the young lone male white smoker was the one I adopted for this one. So the casting call for when the performance is done is usually a number of like Hollywood images of young men smoking, and what has been really nice about seeing that piece in action is, of course, that what happens outside of an art opening is that a lot of people will stand outside smoking. And this one lone smoker who is not in a group, the difference between the smoking alone and smoking socially is creating this distance that makes us see the person as an image, which is in many ways similar to the experience of the actor crying, that this extreme distance and the boundary that is created in between the performer and the audience is somehow creating extra tension for the piece becoming an image.
And I guess there's something in, I guess, by using the Hollywood images as the kind of casting call, there's something, obviously, something cinematic about that, and this idea of coming away or coming through the fourth wall, and this sort of reversal of cinema by bringing it out of the screen and into reality.
Yeah, there is definitely yeah, you're right.
Okay, so I think we've got time for a couple more. There's just 3 more questions. We'll just do these 3. So B. Jones has asked, with your sculptures so often being combinations of loaded objects, I was wondering how many iterations they go through before they become a work. And do you collect and live with the objects for a long time before knowing what to do with them, or is it a case of seeking out particular things?
It's definitely a combination. I get interested in objects and then I start collecting them, and my studio is completely overflowing with things that didn't make it, that I was interested in but haven't made it yet. And there is a case of I need to get to know the object. I very rarely have a plan for them before I start buying them on eBay. So there is this process at the studio where I'm hitting them against each other and jumping on them and pulling them apart and figuring out like where dialogues happen. And for example, the remote control cars were not meant to transport wigs. This was something that happened at the studio. I had a completely different plan for them, and then I had wigs lying around and I tried it out, and it just yeah, worked.
So you must have a lot of fun at your studio with all of the this kind of paraphernalia lying around.
Well, yes, some of the time, and when I have to clean them up and sort them out, it's less fun. Yeah, no, I do. I have too many things at my studio.
Okay, Caitlin Stewart would like to know a bit more about the sculptures with the dishes and the cages.
So these are the dinnerware that's placed in the bird cages is part of a Danish kind of royal porcelain production called Empire, and it's one of the old series that have been produced for a very long time, and that I got interested in this royal dinnerware from an interest in the trade history basically of China. So the fact that all this imported China from China wasn't like European factories were not able to produce the same quality as the stuff that was traveled in, and they tried for 400 years to crack the code. And there's this whole nice story about like how they tried to get the trade secrets and everything. And finally they managed to make the same quality of China, and once they did that, they still copied the original designs of the China that had been brought from China, so the blue ink and everything. So somehow seeing these plates as these kind of high-end knockoffs, because they are highly valued collector's items, they're hand painted, they have all this like unique qualities to them, but they in many ways are no different from the fake designer bags in my other work. So they have that direct relationship as being images of or representations of other objects, and I like them as this.
Thank you. So last question is from Emily, who would like to know about your involvement in setting up each of the works, particularly ones including people. So say in packs, are galleries instructed to recruit the young man through your written instructions, or do you recruit the performers yourself? She's curious to know about the process of who you work with and your relationship to the performers and the participants in your works.
I mean, I need to speak to the people who perform the work to ensure that the protocols are carried out in order for it to actually become a work, because I guess my work always lies in this very subtle balance. And if a dancer is not performing her entire lived history from memory, if she has practiced, or if she brings a prop along, the whole thing is punctured and falls apart. So it's very important for me that I have a conversation and an understanding with, especially if the piece is carried out by people. So yeah, I guess I try to be definitely as involved as possible.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for your time, Nina. It was like super, super interesting, and hopefully the format worked. I think it was really good with the slides, definitely, so that people can kind of get a feel for your videos. So anyone who's wanting to watch this again, it will be uploaded on our website, which is www.davidrobertsartfoundation.com, and you can sign up to our mailing list to get more information about what else is coming up as part of this program. Thanks a lot for joining us. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who was there. I can see some friends here in the list. Bye.
Bye.